Good morning, everyone. It is so lovely to have you here. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar. We're talking about supporting executive functioning. Now, that is something that has such a broad reach. Executive functioning impacts all areas of our lives, and it impacts all areas of the lives of folks with disabilities. So today's going to be a broad overview into the topic so that you can start your own explorations into the way that executive functioning might be impacting, or executive dysfunction rather, might be impacting somebody's day-to-day capabilities, and the way that you might get started at investigating and also intervening with supporting somebody's executive functioning. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land I live and work, and from where this webinar is being broadcast today, and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people present today. This is what we're going to be chatting about today. So we're going to be talking about what is executive functioning. I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot without a lot of clear definitions, so that we know what we're talking about and we know that what we're addressing. So we're going to be talking about what is executive functioning and breaking it down into its constituent parts. We're going to be talking about how disability and executive dysfunction interact, and the way that disabilities might interact with executive functioning, how they might look different, how they might struggle, how they might be really amazing, and just looking at the different ways that different types of disabilities can interact with executive function. We're going to be looking at what are some signs and symptoms that either yourself or somebody you care for might be struggling with their executive functioning. And we're also going to be looking at how can you assess executive functioning, what are the options that are out there in terms of getting started on the road to supporting somebody's executive functioning. We're then going to be talking about, okay, we've established what executive functioning is, we've established that we've got to struggle with it. What can we do? Where do we start with supporting somebody's executive functioning, with putting in place day-to-day accommodations and stuff like that? Next, we will be answering some questions, and at the end, we always follow up with our references. As always, if you'd like to get in touch, if you'd like us to address a specific topic, please do send us an email to hello@transformlife.com.au. All right, so a very valid question that you might be asking is, who is this person? Why is she talking about this? What's her background? So my name's Ella. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer here at Transform Life. I've been working in the allied health and disability space, probably let's say 9 years at this point. So my background and qualifications are in psychology. My degree is in psychology, and now I'm working in positive behaviour support and in clinical executive leadership. So that's me. I've been so lucky in my career. I really have, to be able to work in the homes, in the lives, alongside folks with disabilities and their families. And I really think that all of the important things that I've learned about what matters when you're supporting somebody with a disability haven't been from all, the degrees, the uni study, the internships. They've been from families with disabilities honestly sharing with me what makes a difference to them. So I always say families have taught me everything. So I don't come here to speak for disabled people. I myself don't identify as disabled. What I come here is to share the knowledge that that I have learned from people with disabilities and their families, as well as obviously my study and expertise. So with no further ado, let's get started on what is executive functioning. So I like to think of executive functioning as anything that you do or any thought that you have that is about what you are doing. So we'll just go through this definition here. Executive function and self-regulation skills are the mental processes that enable us to plan, they enable us to focus, they enable us to remember, specifically short term, and also to juggle multiple tasks successfully. So the Harvard Center for Developing the Child have a really good metaphor that I find really helpful at illustrating the role that executive functioning plays in our lives. If we think of our lives as a busy airport, we've got things coming and going. We've got multiple pieces that need to coordinate with each other. That's our brain. We have multiple different systems that need to coordinate. We have different stimuli coming and going. Our executive functioning that takes place in the very front part of our brain, well, primarily, that's a simplified version, is like the air traffic control system. So it's thinking about, okay, how am I organizing these multiple coming and going stimuli? How am I synchronizing these systems together? How am I able to think about the thoughts that I have? Now, executive functioning has a number of different component functions that we're going to go into. And they all need to be really integrated with each other seamlessly to enable the highest level of functioning. And so when we have executive dysfunction, often it's because one or more of these areas of executive functioning are not performing to the highest level. And that could be for a number of reasons that we'll go into. But overall, think of executive functioning as anything that enables the rest of our brain to do what it needs to do. The air traffic control system that's for managing the airport of our brain. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the way that executive functioning can be split into four components. Some people like to think of it as a constellation of different cognitive processes that are involved in managing our day-to-day cognitive functioning. So those are working memory, inhibition, set shifting, and fluency. Now, some of those might have meaning to you and some of them might not. So I'm going to explain them all to you now. So working memory, this might be something that you already have a little bit of familiarity with. Working memory is the memory process within our brains that enables us to keep a piece of information at the forefront of our brains while we're doing something else. A really good example of this is when you need to remember a phone number that's on one piece of paper and put it into your phone by remembering it. So you're looking at one piece of paper, you're thinking 048264, and then you're repeating it to yourself, 048264, 048264. That's your working memory supporting you to transfer a piece of information while you're doing a task. So that's the first part, your working memory. So it enables us to temporarily and in a very short-term process store and manipulate bits of information in conscious awareness. So the other parts of our memory, longer term and even short term to a certain capacity, are actually subconscious. They're sub-awareness levels, but the part of memory that is involved in executive functioning is conscious. You're consciously aware of trying to remember something. The next component is inhibition. Now, this is something that's really related to a lot of the disabilities that I work with a lot and that we see a lot here at Transform Life. Now, inhibition is your ability to, it's your ability to hold back a automatic or predominant reaction that's previously been learned, but that might be inappropriate in a relevant in a specific context. So, for example, you might have had a really scary experience with a dog in your childhood. So your pre-learned reaction is to flinch and have fear anytime you hear a dog barking. But you go into a situation where you hear a dog barking on the TV, and consciously you know, oh, I don't actually have a reason to be afraid in this moment because it's actually just a dog on the TV. You being aware in that moment of halting your pre-learned or automatic response to that stimuli is your inhibition executive functioning kicking in. It's the kind of thing that when you have an impulse to engage in a behavior, it's the voice in your head that says, don't do that. We decided not to do this, remember? So lots of people think of this colloquially as oh, what's the word that I'm thinking of? They think of it as self-control. Self-control, discipline, that kind of thing. And we see that it can be really tricky for folks who have things like ADHD, or emotional dysregulation of some kind. So the next component is called set shifting. Now, this is something that you maybe haven't heard of as much in the kind of colloquial literature. Now, set shifting is it's an ability that helps us to modify the attention, the behavior that we're exhibiting in response to changing circumstances and demands. So it's the ability that allows us to modulate our behavior based on the context in which it's appropriate. So somebody who might be struggling with executive functioning could do something like having overly or unhelpfully rigid ideas of what appropriate behavior is, irrespective of the context in which it's being required. So that could be a dysfunction of somebody's set shifting capacity within their executive functioning. The next one is fluency. Now, fluency is something that it's quite specific, and it actually represents the ability to produce produce information on demand at the pace at which you want to get access to it. So it's the ability to kind of maximize the production of verbal or visual information over a specific time period, at the same time as not repeating unhelpful information during that time period. So an example of this might be when you're trying to brainstorm, for example, every word that you can think of that starts with the letter G in 20 seconds. So your fluency skills are the skills that would either give you a lot of information during that time. You can think of all these words that start with G without repeating, or have far fewer. So if you were to have fluency dysfunction in your executive functioning, you would be unable to think of as many words in that time that somebody else who had really high fluency skills in their executive functioning would be able to use, or would be able to come up with. So I think it's interesting that the different components can really be impacted in different ways, and any in any treatment, any intervention that we're trying to put in place for these people really needs to be individualized. So I guess there's lots of specific different tests that we can try, and those kinds of things. But I think it's important to recognize that the issues that we have with these often come about when there's an issue in the neural networks that connect the different parts of the brain that are providing these functions. So it might be an issue with their white matter, or with the myelination of the axons, which are what connect the different neurons in the brain. So all the different brain areas that are involved in these sorts of functions need to be connected in the right ways to enable us to function at the highest level. And when there is a disruption to these things, that's when we get a difference in the functioning of any one of these four areas. So there's the neural network that provides this functioning. It works primarily in the prefrontal cortex, as I've mentioned before, this front part of the brain directly behind the eyes, but it also connects to the basal ganglia, the thalamus, which is further back in the brain, and the cerebellum, which is right at the back of the brain. So the disabilities that can impact executive functioning, a big one is ADHD. We see a lot of research and community feedback around the executive functioning impact that ADHD can have on someone. Autism, Down syndrome, depression and anxiety, and acquired brain injury. can all have different kinds of impacts on somebody's executive functioning. So, how do we know if somebody might be struggling with some area of their executive functioning? So, there's a few signs and symptoms of executive functioning that might raise some red flags for yourself if it's somebody you're caring for, or for the allied health professionals who might be working with that person. And a really big one is trouble managing emotions. Now, I know that emotional regulation, emotional dysregulation is something that's really prominent at the moment in the community, talking about what level of expectation should we have for people to be able to manage their emotions independently, and from what age. But one of the things that we really see when somebody is struggling with their emotional dysregulation is what we just mentioned before, is that inhibition struggle. So that inhibition component of their executive functioning means that they're unable to manage their emotions or their emotional impulses. So you might see some problems with starting tasks. So initiating tasks, organizing or planning tasks, or completing tasks. Any of those areas could be a sign that somebody's a specific component of somebody's executive functioning might be being impacted. Trouble listening or paying attention can be something that can be involved in executive dysfunction, specifically something to do with the working memory. Is that person not able to process the auditory information and hold that in their functioning working memory? If so, then that might be a sign of executive dysfunction. Not paying attention. That's a really big one that we see when somebody is really struggling to inhibit their distracting either internal or external stimuli that's not allowing them to stay on task. And that's very separate from being motivated to stay on task. So somebody can be very motivated to stay on task and wanting to complete something, but if they've got an impairment in their inhibition, the inhibition component of their executive functioning, then that's going to be a flag that we see, the inability to stay on task. So inability to multitask can be another sign that there's something going on, possibly with somebody's working memory or with their fluency. Ability to balance tasks as well, to be able to change between tasks, can be something that we see that's an issue that can be a sign of somebody with executive dysfunction. And socially inappropriate behavior or ability to learn from the past. So those two things are something that can be a sign of somebody struggling with their set shifting component of their executive dysfunction. So set shifting, as we spoke about, is the ability to modulate your behaviors based on the context in which you find yourself to get the best outcomes. And if somebody is having socially inappropriate behaviors or they're unable to reflect on social feedback from previous contexts and apply that to altering their behavior for current social contexts, then that may be something that is a sign of a person having issues with their, that may be a sign of a person having issues with the set shifting component of their executive functioning. So there's a whole bunch of different assessments that we can engage to understand a little bit more about somebody's executive functioning. Now, you don't have to go and spend lots of money to have access to information about somebody's executive functioning. There are some very high quality, no cost to consumer tools online that you can access that will give you some more insights into what areas of executive functioning somebody might be struggling with. So I think it's important to remember that we don't have to go and spend a whole bunch of money on, expensive psychological or occupational therapy testing to understand that somebody is struggling with their executive functioning. If you have questions about somebody's executive functioning, ask your allied health professional for any resources that they might be able to share with you that can give you some more insight into the specific domain or component of executive functioning that is impacting that person's behavior. Like we said, if somebody might be struggling with inappropriate social behavior, could that be a set shifting issue? And, we can find some free resources on that. That being said, there are, of course, lots of there are lots of different types of assessments and testing and those kinds of things that your allied health professionals can do for you. So OTs can do a wonderful different array of functional testing for somebody who we suspect may have executive dysfunction, and they can do great testing to understand, okay, how are the different domains of executive functioning impacting different functional capacities in somebody's life. And then psychologists can do really good, really detailed testing on specific cognitive processing functionality um, within executive functioning that can really get into the nitty gritty of, okay, which cognitive process is this person having trouble with that means they're not able to connect two particular dots that is causing them to struggle in these ways. So because there's so many elements of executive functioning, there are many, many different types of testing that we could do. So any type of, I'm not going to suggest any one particular type of testing because it would need to be tailored to that person's specific area of functioning that they're looking to build on, or the specific area of deficit that we might be noticed. But I put a few on screen here for you. You can see that there's so these ones I think might be specific to children. So the verbal fluency test, the WAIS and the Wyatt, and those sorts of things can all test different parts of executive functioning. So let's get on to the exciting stuff, which is what can we do? What can we do if somebody we either ourselves or somebody we care for is struggling with some element of their executive functioning, or we suspect that they might be? As I said before, the first thing that we've got to do is to ascertain the area of functioning that needs assistance. And so that starts with assessment. But often, depending on that person's level of insight, they may be able to give you some clues and feedback around either experiences they're having or not having. Do they have the experience of being able to hold something in their conscious short-term memory while they're working? Do they have the experience of not being able to remember something even though they want to? Do they have the experience of not being able to, say, keep their cool when they would really like to be able to, or something like that? So make sure that before you do anything, you check in with that person to the level that they're able to communicate with them in the way that they best understand, to get their insights about what their executive functioning looks like. After we've done that, maybe we've been through some test batteries, we've talked to our allied health professional, we then begin a skill building program to address the specific area of dysfunction that we've noticed. So I always like, as a clinician, I always find that if we can get whoever we're working with, that person, to get the level of insight that's possible for them cognitively, developmentally, into their own dysfunction, the more that we can get them to understand, the better outcomes we're going to have. So, and that's going to look different for everybody depending on what developmental stage they're at. So if we can have a discussion with somebody or help them to understand, look, we're going to be doing some work to help you with your executive functioning. We're going to be doing some work to help you to remember things. We're going to be helping you do some work so that you can pay attention through a whole episode of Bluey. How great is that going to be? Do you want to do that? Helping them to understand what the goal is, because executive functioning work is really quite cognitive based, and anything that's cognitive based is the skill building is going to be based on the idea of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is something that's been thrown around in media and that kind of thing, but it's fundamentally based on the idea of the use it or lose it principle, and that is that our brains are really malleable. Our brains respond to the way that we use them, and they both build up and also do what's called shearing of neuronal almost hardware based on how we use them. And there's some amazing research out there by what's his name, Dr. Norman Deutsch. And he talks about, okay, the brain has this incredible ability to build up capacity, to build up new skills, to physically build new areas of the brain to support specific functions. So any type of intervention that we're going to be putting in place that builds executive functioning skills is going to be based on the underlying principle of neuroplasticity. That is, the brain is going to come to the party as we are attempting to rebuild a specific skill. So that means that it can be there can be a lot of repetition. There can be a lot of doing things that specifically that are difficult for someone, and it can be a lot of hard concentration and work. And for somebody with executive functioning, that can be really tricky. So if we've got somebody to a point of understanding and motivation, so that it's meaningful to them, we're more likely to be able to do the kind of work that can actually get changes in the executive functioning outcome. Now, I know that all sounds a little bit nebulous, but I've got some examples of things that you might be able to use as part of this process here. So executive functioning is one of the areas of disability that actually can be really well supported using assistive technologies. And there's lots of mainstream assistive technologies that can be so incredibly helpful for specific areas of executive dysfunction. So here on the screen, I've got your Apple Watch, your smartwatch. I work with somebody who has an acquired brain injury, and I know that working memory can be something that impacts their day-to-day functioning. And so this wasn't even something that I put in, it was something that they figured out on their own, but they figured out that working memory was something that impacted them when they were driving. So they used their smartwatch to give them a little buzz so that they know when an upcoming skill is being required of them when they're driving. So that might be, okay, I know that I'm going to lose my working memory of where I'm going and what I need to do. But to counteract that, this person uses their watch to buzz them, to remind them, oh, okay, right, I've got something that's coming up that I need to do. I need to turn, I need to indicate, I need to, whatever it might be. What an incredible accommodation they've figured out for themselves. I've just got a little reminder icon up here on the screen. As I say, it doesn't have to be fancy, but there's lots of different reminder, obviously apps and those kinds of things that can be really helpful for somebody who's struggling with an area of executive dysfunction. I've got the Live Scribe Smart Pen. Now, this is something that I prescribed for somebody that I'm working with at the moment. Now, this person has some working memory struggles that mean that during class, even in the middle of receiving an instruction, they can forget what's happening and they can become quite disoriented, and that's really distressing, obviously. So the Live Scribe Smart Pen, it records, it audio records, and it also visually records what you're writing, so that if you do have the experience of forgetting what's going on in the middle of receiving an instruction, or in this person's case, in the middle of a class, they can just link it to their headphones, and the pen will play back to them the audio instruction that they've received. Which, as you can imagine, can be so helpful in a classroom where you can't necessarily be asking the teacher every 2 seconds to repeat the instruction. That person has a tool, has an accommodation, has an assistive technology that allows their executive functioning to be better supported. Okay, so those are just some examples. There's lots of them, but I think it's something that really can be well supported by assistive technologies in combination with skill building programs that can enable that person to increase their independence of their executive functioning. So I think I'll stop it there. If there are any questions, we can chat about them. Otherwise, we can meet again next week.